What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero, back with another Retro Yu-Gi-Oh video and back with another Perfect Circle format video. I've been really enjoying this format, although I've not had the time that I've really wanted to put into it. But we are nearing the end of my coverage anyway for it. There should be like 4 or 5 more videos, I believe, on this format. So that should take us to, mid-February at the latest, I assume. But hopefully I have time to cover everything that I want to cover for it. But this format is iconic for a reason. It's very, very fun, based around the January 2008 SJC Orlando using the September 2007 ban list here. And now, while Perfect Circle Monarch is the deck that sort of dominates the modern version of the format and also was very dominant back in the day, there are other things that you can play. And there are some very unique ideas that are running around in the format, one of which involves Necroface. Necroface is a very unique monster. Has 2 different effects. It says if this card normal summon, you shuffle all banished cards into the deck, and this card gains 100 for each card shuffled into the main deck by this effect. So in that way, it's kind of like a Grenmaju to Iza in a way. I actually prefer it kind of to Grenmaju to Iza. I know this deck side decks the Grenmajus here, which we'll get to when I cover that. But honestly, having this as just a big beater could be a cool payoff to a banished sort of strategy. But the main thing that this deck is trying to do with this card is the secondary effect, where if this card is banished, each player banishes 5 cards from the top of their deck or their entire deck if it's less than 5. So basically what you can do with this card is if you get to banishing your deck and, one Necroface banishes another, which banishes another, that's 15 cards already gone. And so you can actually play a fairly good mill deck with this card, which is cool because mill has not really been viable for a very long time in the game. You had Empty Jar way back when, but just decks, got too fast paced, had too much removal. And there were just other better stall strategies that you could do as opposed to milling. But now we have a mill deck that could actually potentially have some legs. So very, very cool to see. And this list here was innovated by Scout Zero. I did make one minor change. They had only 2 Return from the Third Dimension in the main deck. I added a third. I wasn't quite sure what to cut, so I left it at 41 cards. And this is sort of something that you can do if you're trying to figure out, your deck wants to be at 40, but like you got to figure out which card is maybe not pulling its weight and what can be cut here. I wasn't quite able to figure out what card I would like to cut in the future. I think all these cards have their own purposes in the deck, and some of them are not searchable, right? Like Soul Release and Burial, you're not really going to be using all too often, but like since they are unsearchable and the deck does banish a lot of itself, you kind of want to have multiple copies in rotation just so that way you hopefully don't lose both of them. But I do think maybe a Burial could be cut because Burial you kind of pair with Soul Release, and if you don't have both, it can be kind of awkward. But it is still a pretty, good set of cards, so I don't quite know what to cut. And maybe the answer is just keeping it at 40 cards because you are banishing a lot of stuff from your deck, so maybe it's fine just going above 40. I don't quite know at this point, but it is definitely a very interesting strategy here. So, of course, the main game plan is banishing Necroface, and we've got a bunch of different ways to do that, one of which is the Banisher of the Radiance and Macrocosmos package here. You could also play Dimensional Fissure as well, but this deck chose not to do it. I think that's personally fine, honestly. Having 9 banished floodgates can be a bit of a lot. It can guarantee that you draw them, sure, but like you're likely going to be drawing them anyways, and you don't necessarily want to brick on a ton of them, right? There's an argument to actually cutting Banisher from the main deck and replacing it with Dim Fizz, because they basically do the same sort of thing, where you activate them or summon them in the case of Banisher, and then you get your banishes turned online. So unlike with Macro, where you have to wait a turn, these are like active banish stuff, and Dimensional Fissure does not play into things like Bottomless Trap Hole. But, your deck is also very susceptible to spell trap removal, so maybe you're fine having the Banisher instead of the Dimensional Fissure. I don't quite know. There's a lot of open questions with this deck list so far. But beyond those banished cards, we've also got the Soul Releases to banish the Necrofaces. That's why they're important. Burial is also important to put things back in grave for the Soul Releases. And as a note, Burial can operate under things like Macro and Banisher because it puts into the graveyard specifically. So it's kind of a weird sort of thing, but it does need work that way. I looked up the ruling for it. So unless it didn't work that way at the time, but I'm pretty sure it did still work that way at the time. So it's good to replenish your graveyard there. We've also got Gold Sark to banish the Necrofaces as well, which is a great combo starter. You just activate Gold Sark, banish a Necroface, banish 5 more, get back that Necroface in 2 turns, potentially banish it again. So that's pretty good there. We got 3 Needleworm to mill down our opponent's deck. We've got a Morphing Dart to mill down their deck as well as drawing more cards. And we got a Marshmallow to stall a bit. Maybe the Marshmallow is what can be cut here, but stalling is kind of nice in certain scenarios. But, you know, the deck is playing other ways to sort of like replenish its life points a bit to hopefully not get to a point where you're going to lose the game, mainly Soul Absorption. This is a very, very good card. If you have it up while you're banishing a bunch of stuff, you gain 500 life points for each card banished when it's banished. And that can be a lot, especially if you've got a Floodgate up. So you can gain a ton of life points, especially if you have multiple of these. And while I showed in the Baboon Bird video that that's not necessarily enough to actually guarantee a victory, sometimes it really can bring you all the way there. So very, very good card in this deck. We've also got ways to dig deeper into our deck. We got Dark World Dealings ×3, great way to draw into our deck. Also pitch a Necroface to set up for a Soul Release, very good. We got Card Destruction to dig deeper as well. We got Upstart Goblin ×3 because we don't care about our opponent's life points really. And that's it for the sort of filtration here. You could add like Jar of Greeds or things like that, but I think it's kind of just a bit too much. And you really do want your filtration things to be active. You don't necessarily want to have your jars up, you know, like draw jar, set it, wait a turn, activate it next turn. Like you don't really want that because the deck can be kind of fragile if it doesn't get the pieces it needs pretty quickly. So we've also got Sword of Living Light to stall a bit for when we don't have the tools that we need. We get triple Dark Bribe along with triple Solemn. Now these negate the things that would stop your Banished Floodgates or things like that from going through. And Dark Bribe actually does double duty in this deck because it draws your opponent a card, which normally is a downside for the card, but in this deck where you're trying to deck out your opponent, it actually is an upside here. We've also got a Mirror Force and a Torrential Tribute, the classic battle traps that, you know, destroy your opponent's stuff. And we got Triple Return here. Now Triple Return may seem weird since you don't really care as much about your opponent's life points, but the reason we have it is because if we bring back some Necrofaces, they do get banished in the end phase. They're not destroyed. So that means that we can go for even more banished plays with returns, which is why I felt like this should be up to 3. While you don't necessarily want to draw multiples of it at a time, if you've got like a couple Necrofaces in rotation banished, then this thing can basically result in a lot of Necrofaces banishing your opponent's stuff away. So very, very good card overall. And I believe you can actually use it again in the end phase. So I believe you can use one, and then in the end phase of the turn, after your monsters get banished, you can then activate another, bring back some more monsters, and then banish them again. So I believe that does work that way. So even drawing multiples is not terrible, depending on the game state you're in. For the side deck, there's a lot of different stuff here. You know, we've got Banish to the Lights as more floodgates here. Your Grand Magi to Aiza if we need to get more aggressive. I put in some double snares because I felt like Royal Decree is a major problem for this deck as well as Jinzo, and double snare hits all of those. We get an MST to deal with our opponent's back row, like a Royal Decree, for instance. We got Pulling the Rugs for Monarch decks. Now you could potentially main this because Perfect Circle Monarch is very popular, but I feel like it's fine just keeping it on the side because frankly, your deck does pretty well against Perfect Circle Monarch on its own. The main reason you bring this in is if your opponent has either another deck that operates off of normal summons of monsters that trigger, which some decks do, or if they're playing a more pure Monarch deck, not really bothering with the hero engine, this can be a bit necessary for that. We got double Raigeki Break to pop our opponent's stuff, and then we just got a random fusion deck that we're never going into. But that's going to do it for the deck breakdown. Let's dive into some games and see how this deck actually plays. So we got a match against Rago Dragaway from guests on the channel. This is the only match we have for this video. As I've said, I haven't had as much time as I'd like for this format recently, but hopefully this match will still illustrate the strengths and weaknesses of this deck. One of the weaknesses of this deck, if you could call it a weakness, is that it is pretty hard to play. So I definitely do misplay a lot in these matches. Hopefully I'll be able to catch all the mistakes that I made, but if I made any that I don't comment on here, please let me know down in the comments below. So to start off with, I go for an upstart to draw deeper in the deck, and then I just decide to set a Necroface, Macro, and Solemn. My reason for this is that I want to get Necroface banished as quickly as possible. I do a Macro set as well, so I can flip the Macro when they try and do something here, and leave it at that. So I think this is a fine play, honestly, but we'll see what our opponent does here. They go for a Rhoda here, and they're going to search out a Stratos. This is likely Perfect Circle Monarch. It could be Big City as well, but I feel like it mostly needs Perfect Circle Monarch. And in a vacuum, we're just going to activate the Macrocosmos on the ad of the Disc Commander, because if they've got Destiny Draw, this does prevent the Disc Commander from going to grave. So I want to set that up there. It looks like they do not have a Destiny Draw that they're willing to commit into a Macrocosmos, so I'm hopeful that that did stop something. They're going to attack into the Necroface. And this is a bit awkward for us. I was hoping maybe a Cider would come down and they'd beat over that way, but now the Necroface is just on field, so it's a bit rough. Now, I have two different options here because I want to craft the Necroface into the Stratus here no matter what. Option number one is just summoning out the Banisher and just having another line of defense against if they have, like, Phoenix Within the Lost. That's the real kicker for this deck, because if they Phoenix Within the Lost the Macrocosmos, then we're in a really, really bad spot. But I also figure that I kind of want to get defensive with the Marshmallow here, so I could just set that instead in main 2. And ultimately, I decided to go for the Marshmallow play. I think this was a mistake on my part. I probably should have gone for Banisher, because once I get the Necrofaces online and get them in rotation, then the Burial gets turned online. Then, I just am completely floodgating my opponent here, even if I can't protect the Banisher. And I can always set the Marshmallow next turn, because if they do have Phoenix Within the Blast for the macro, I kind of have to Solemn that. Because that's just such a brutal play for us. We get draw locked for a turn, basically. Our Necro's in grave as opposed to banished, so we're not setting up our stuff. So, that's 4,000 life points lost, which is not quite as defensive as something like Set Marshmallow would want to preserve. So, I am just going to go for the Solemn there because I kind of have to, but I am kicking myself for not summing out the Banisher. Even if they had like a Torrential Tribute, well, Torrential Tribute wouldn't matter because the Necroface would be banished anyway. Same with Mirror Force, actually. So if they had either of those, I was honestly fine with that because I'm still taking probably less damage than I took here. So I think I should have just summoned out the Banisher. I think it was the correct play to do, but you live and learn. Playing this deck is definitely a learning experience, and you get better at it every time you do it. So we don't banish any Necrophases here, unfortunately. We also banish a Return, which is kind of rough. Would have liked that around, but we do banish our opponent's Mally and their Crush card, so I'm feeling good about that. And then main 2, we're going to set a Marshmallow and pass back to them, but knowing that they're on Perfect Circle Monarch, seeing that Ryza, Marshmallow on set is an even worse play than it was otherwise, potentially, because now they can just spin back the Marshmallow and get in for more damage. Whereas if we had the Solemn or something like that up, then we could potentially done something here. Although Solemn would have eaten the heavy there, so wouldn't have really mattered that much. I think they still would have probably, been cooking us here because we would have Solemned on the heavy. They would have tributed out a Ryza, spun back our Marshmallow, gotten in for 24 either way, despite these strategies being banished. And then we would have just done this same play, setting Marshmallow, setting Burial. And then they would have had the DD Warrior Lady either way there. So I think we were kind of cooked no matter what we did there, even if we did play correctly. But, I do think that even if we were cooked either way, it is good to note the correct plays because there are some games where we won't necessarily be cooked if we play correctly, right? So it's always good to keep that in mind and analyze your replays, even if it was a lost cause, is always good to have. But anyways, we're just going to summon out a Banisher, set 4, pass back to our opponent. We've got Solemn and Dark Bribe in case they do Heavy Storm here. Now, obviously, we don't want to necessarily directly play 4,000 life points to stop a Heavy, but Dark Bribe can stop that Heavy with much less cost, and we can potentially save the Solemn for later. We got Mirror Force to protect the Banisher, so I feel pretty good about this. This also stops things like D-Draw, for instance, so I feel pretty good about that. We draw into a Pulling the Rug, and we're going to set the Pulling the Rug in main 1. Now, this does play around Morphing Jar, and the reason I said it's not really to play around Morphing Jar, it's to make my opponent think that I'm playing around Morphing Jar, so then they're not maybe considering a Morphing Jar of their own as much if they attack into it next turn. So I set the Pulling the Rug, set the Morphing Jar there. And I attack into Gravekeeper's Spy. Darn, it was not a Morphing Jar. Who could have thought that Perfect Circle Monarch would not be playing Morphing Jar? But now, hopefully, I planted the seed in my opponent's mind that, that set here is not Morphing Jar potentially, and we can be in a pretty decent spot. They're going to attack in with the Warrior Lady there, flipping over that Morphing Jar. And they can't actually Phoenix Moon Blast this because it is damage step, so they can't do that. And we'll play as if we, forget the Phoenix Moon Blast being there. So they will banish 3 cards, including a Disc Commander, which I'm pretty happy about. And that Morphing Jar will get banished here either way. So my opponent's going to set 1, pass back to us. We draw into an Upstart Goblin. Now we have a full back row. That is the downside to setting all these cards here. But my reasoning was that, like, if they don't do anything that I need to use these on, I still have them for later, right? So I am perfectly okay just summoning out a Necroface now and attacking into the Warrior Lady here. If they do have Mirror Force, I can potentially just let that go by chaining like macro to it, which I'm not too upset about. They're going to go for Phoenix Within the Blast here on our Banisher here. I'm going to go for a macro, and they're going to go for a Dust Tornado on the macro. We're going to Dark Bribe that. They can't actually chain a Dust Tornado to this, so this is actually an error on our part. This should not have happened this way, but we missed it here. You can't actually chain a Dust Tornado to a Counter Trap because Counter Traps are at a higher spell speed, so we would not have actually had to use the Solemn here. The attack, I believe, would have gone through. Well, it depends on whether they activate this on like Attack Declaration or like later in the battle step, because what they could have done is done this on Attack Declaration, tried to spin this back, and or spin back the Banisher, that is, and then after that failed because it was Dark Bribe, or the Dust Tornado with Dark Bribe, that is, then later in the battle step, they could have potentially activated Dust Tornado on the macro. So I think that this is kind of a scuffed game state, but like it's not one that couldn't happen there. It's just kind of scuffed. But anyways, we also forget a key thing here, that the Phoenix Bloom Blast was not negated. So the Banish the Radiance should be on top of the deck here. So it should have gotten banished. And then next turn we'd be drawing into Soul Absorption instead of whatever else we were drawing into. And we would not have this Banisher here. We also banished another Necroface. So actually we wouldn't be drawing into Soul Absorption. Banisher would also be banished here. So let's see what we would have been drawing into. We would have been drawing into another macro, which is not terrible here. But we do not banish another Necroface there. We just banished the second one there because the third one is in hand. But if we get that third one banished, we could potentially make things happen here. But yeah, so our opponent's at 16. We're at 18 in terms of deck size. And we're just going to go for an upstart to try and draw deeper into our stuff. So we would have drawn a macro here as opposed to a Soul Absorption. We would have drawn Soul Absorption next turn. Would that have changed much? I don't really think so. We're just going to activate Soul Absorption and activate Swords. They go for MST on the Soul Absorption. Maybe they would have MST'd the Swords instead, but that's only if they really have a way to get something through here at least, I think. They're going to go for a DD Survivor off that Rhoda. Makes sense against the Banish deck that they're playing a Banish card. They're going to bring con our Banisher, tribute that for a Ryza, targeting these Swords. And I'm going to pulling the rug that just to deal with the Ryza. I could have just waited and then Mirror Forced the board, leaving the pulling on field. But with one Ryza already gone and one Stratus already gone, I feel like pulling is not really going to get as much value now as it is later in the game. So I just let that go through. But I maybe should have just, not done that. But I drawn to return here. Whereas, as I mentioned, I would have drawn into something else here. Would have drawn into something one card back in the banish. So I think I would have drawn into a macro. Yeah, I would have drawn in, or no, would that have been, yeah, I think it would have drawn into macro. And then return would be the next card on top of the deck. So I probably would have set the return here, or maybe I wouldn't have. No, I probably wouldn't have because they've got Heavy Storm still in rotation. So maybe they'd heavy. They're going to go for a Rhoda here, searching out a Fearmonger, grabbing that to hand, and then setting one and passing back to us. We draw into Soul Release now. So now we would have drawn into return. We would have set return here. Soul Release doesn't really do much for us because we don't have any burials. They're going to set one and Swords will expire. Now we draw a burial. So what I should do here is just go for burial, which is what I do. Go for burial here. Send back 2 Necrofaces and a Banisher. And then I will go for a Soul Release here, banishing those 2 Necrofaces and that Banisher to banish 10 cards from the top of each of our decks. And now I'm going to go for a return here to try and bring back as much as possible. So I would have had to wait a turn to do this. And if we check the 10th card that they would have had, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So it actually would have been heavy. Maybe that would have affected things here. But I don't think it ultimately would have affected too much because I would have just returned. Well, I wouldn't have been able to return on their turn actually. But they still would have been lower in cards than us here. We would have probably had a macro in hand. And then if they attacked over the Necroface here, we would have Soul Released it anyways. So I think we were still in a commanding position if I had not messed up what happened with the Banisher getting spun back to the top. But either way here, it should be fine. But yeah, return will banish the Necrophase in the end phase and banish the remainder of their deck. So either way, I think we were winning that one. We were in a really good spot. We had Mirror Force would not have been there, but we had Marshmallow set, so they would have had to attack the Whirly into the Marshmallow and then attack double Spy indirectly, but they would have had to deal with the Necroface that we had set first. So I think we still would have been winning that one, but it just definitely would have been less, assured, right? But they're going to go for a Roto for Stratos, search out a Mally, de-draw away the Mally, get that engrave before we can set up any banish stuff. And we're going to go for an upstart, trying to draw deeper in our deck. We draw into Dark Bribe, and we're going to go for a Dark World Dealings here. If we draw into Necroface, we can pitch that. But if not, hopefully we can draw something good. Draw into a second Soul Absorption. That's a bit interesting here. I do decide to pitch that Soul Absorption because ultimately, the 500 extra life points is nice, especially when we're going to Soul Release a bunch of stuff here. But I figure 1 should be enough because we do want a Soul Release here because if they bring out a Mally here, they could set up a a Light and Darkness Dragon, and that would be really bad for us because that checked a lot of what we're trying to do here. So we do want to avoid that at all costs here. They will MST our Soul Absorption on the activation of the Soul Release here. We're just going to banish 1 random card from our graveyard and all 4 of their monsters from theirs. So they can't bring back the Jinzo. Mally is gone now, so they can't bring out another Mally off that. And then we're just going to set a Morphing Jar, Pulling, and Dark Bribe here and pass back to our opponent. They are going to tribute for a Ryza here. Luckily, that does hit the pulling, so we're pulling that. They're going to set 2 and pass back to us. We feel pretty good about this. We're going to set the Marshmallow on just to preserve as much value as possible here, and then flip up the Morphing Jar, and they did indeed have the Lad, so I'm very glad I did banish the Sword Release there, or the Mally off the Sword Release there. But anyways, we're just going to attack in for 700. Doesn't really matter here, but they do have the Dim Priz to stop our Morphing Jar from getting in the chip damage. I think that's fine. This also plays around if we had like Book to set down the Morphing Jar and flip it back up again. So I think it's fine to go for the Dim Priz there. But now we're just going to set a Pulling and a Solemn and pass back to them. We don't set the Return here because they do have heavy, like, you know, we're probably going to Dark Bribe or Solemn Heavy, but like if they do have other spell trap removals here, like, let's say they can somehow get into a demock after going for heavy and stuff, and they manage to clear our whole board, or they just blind snipe back row. I don't necessarily want them to hit return because we don't have it set up here. We just have a Morphing Jar banished, which is not really something we want to bring it back off return. So I figure I can hold it here for later. They're going to go for a D-drop pitching that dead Mally there because the other Mally is gone. And they're going to go for a Roto searching on ATD Survivor, which is very annoying for our deck to deal with if we were attacking in here, but we're not. So they're going to knock our Marshmallow on, go for a Reaper here, which is going to be a bit rough for us depending on what they hit. Now, I could solve this. It is something that I could potentially solve because I've got such a great hand. I've got a Banished Floodgate, I've got a Necroface, I've got a Return in hand. I've got so much good stuff here that I'm very tempted to solve. But I think ultimately I just have to eat the L here, take the 300, and then hope that I draw into something to replenish this. If I lose the Necroface in grave, I do have one more Soul Release left in deck to hopefully banish it here. But yeah, luckily they hit the Banisher, which I'm not too upset about. They're going to go for a call here, target these Stratos. I don't necessarily want them to get the search, although I could potentially let this go through. I think in hindsight, maybe I should have. They're not popping a thing here. Worst thing that they can do is really like search out a Disc Commander, which I'm not too upset about. Because they need a way to bring that back. And if I get a banish thing online, then I'm fine with it. So I think actually I should have held the Dark Bribe here. But I got a bit, you know, scared of the Stratos. I don't think I should have, though. That was definitely a mistake on my part. But we draw into a return or a burial, which is not really going to be the best, but we set everything anyways because if they manage to clear our Necroface here, we don't want to lose one of the cards in hand. So we're going to pass back to them. They do have a DD Warrior Lady here. I'm very happy about that because in order to get over this Necroface, they do have to banish here. They're thinking about this, and they ultimately will decide to banish. I think this is actually a major misplay on their part because it just increases the clock that we've got here. If we've got return to the macro, then it basically turns on our win condition here. But yeah, they don't really have anything to stop that either. So I think they should have just sat on it. Like, yes, it's annoying. Let's see their hand here. They didn't have a way to deal with Necroface otherwise, so I guess that's why they did it. But it is still a major risk because we potentially just win the game here off that. Unfortunately for us, we do not hit any other Necrofaces to accelerate the clock further. But they will set one and pass back to us. We draw into an Upstart Goblin, so we can go for that. Just try and draw deeper into our deck. And that is indeed what we will do. So we'll give them 1,000. We draw into Dark World Dealings. Now, I make a bit of a suspect play here. I don't think I should have done this play, but I do it anyways. I activate a Dark World Dealing just to get one card deeper into our deck. The way I figured it is like if I draw into Necroface, I pitch that, get that engraved for later in case I draw into Soul Release, which is still in my deck. And if it's something else, then, you know, the filtration card's basically kind of just going away. You know, it's kind of doing its job in a weird way. If it's a Banished Floodgate, that's kind of annoying, but we've got plenty of other Banished Floodgates in our deck. Actually, we don't actually have too many. We've got 2 more left in our deck, so maybe that is definitely a big risk on my part. But yeah, if this is Soul Release, that's annoying for us because then it makes our Necrophases off the top a bit trickier to utilize. There's a lot of different things, reasons for not playing this card here. I think what I should have done, I should have set the dealings, and then next turn I would have drawn a card, activated dealings, and then I have 2 cards to pick from to discard instead of 1. So this was a bad choice on my part, but I, you know, made it anyways, and I pitch an Upstart Goblin there, which probably would have been better to have next turn as a potential discard here. They're going to go for a Spirit Reaper plus a DD Survivor. I don't have my Banished Floodgates up, and even if I do, I don't really care about DD Survivor coming back over and over again. So I'm just going to let that go through. I draw into a Gold Sark. That's a great draw. I can go for the Gold Sark here. Banish that Necroface. And then we'll banish 5 each. So I feel pretty good about that. And honestly, this would have basically turned out the same way as I did with the dealings here. Because what would have happened, I would have drawn Dust Shoot. Upstart this turn. Activated dealing, drawn into Gold Sark, pitched the Upstart. Because Gold Sark is just so good here. But I missed that Necroface there. I only got 1, none of the others, and I've only got 1 return left. This is my final return, but if I manage to pull it off, it will be the end of the game. So I go for return here. They go for Decree. I go for Solemn to stop that Decree. They go for Dust Tornado. They can't do that because, you know, the Solemn can't be chained to. So yeah, we will manage to stop that Decree there and bring back these Necrofaces and a Banisher and just a bunch of other stuff that don't really matter because we just have to special summon as many of them as possible. So on res, they're going to just go for a Dust Tornado here. Doesn't really matter, but yeah, I mean, they're going to go for Crush Card as well. Again, doesn't really matter, just pops the Banisher. But yeah, at the end of the turn, these Necrofaces are going to go back into the banish pile, and that will banish the remainder of their deck here. So we will also lose 10 cards here, but it won't matter. It just shows off more of our deck, I guess. And there's that last Necroface. So we'll actually banish the entirety of our deck. And yeah, it's just going to be a Dust Shoot and a Mirror Force set there. And yeah, so I think I definitely misplayed these games, as I mentioned. Again, if there were any misplays that I missed, let me know in the comments below. But I do think this deck is really cool. Now, I do think it's also pretty fragile. Like this game 3, I think honestly we maybe should not have won because we were in a really bad spot for most of the game. We didn't have a banished floodgate up, and that made our Necroface a lot worse. We had to get lucky with our opponent banishing our Necroface there. Although you could argue that that's kind of what they had to do because they didn't really have a good way to beat over it otherwise. But I do think that, like, if we had not had that banish, then, you know, maybe things would have been a bit worse for us here. But either way, the deck's very cool. I like it a lot. It is definitely on the more degenerate side of things, so not everyone's going to like this style of deck being in the format, but if it makes you feel better, I don't think it's necessarily a tier 1 deck. I think it is kind of gimmicky, and the gimmicky nature of it does sort of gatekeep it from high-level play, because if this deck ever did get, like, really, really good, then people would just bring in things to stop it, right? This deck is a little bit more hateable than things like Macro Monarch, right? Macro Monarch is a very good deck that does see a lot of play, mainly because it counters a lot of meta, and it also gets to play the Monarch cards, which are very strong, and that's a lot more of an active deck, where this deck is a bit more of a passive deck until it draws what it needs to be active. And I think because of that, Macro Monarch is just going to be the better deck overall, and if people do bring in hate for Macro Monarch, then that's going to hate out this deck as well, and this deck is a lot more reliant on its banishes than Macro Monarch is, so I do think this deck is, you know, probably tier 2 at best. It could definitely prove me wrong because it does have a very explosive rate of play. If you do draw the right things and banish the right things, you just mill out your opponent in one turn, which is obviously, like, very, very cool. But I do think ultimately most of the games that you're going to have are not going to go like that. And you can still win games here, but I'm not really sure it's going to be as consistent as some of the other decks in the format. But let me know what you think about this deck down in the comments below. Also, let me know what other decks you want me to cover in Perfect Circle format. Right now, my main plans are Six Samurai, Cloudians, and Nurse Burn. I'm pretty sure those are the 3 that I'm thinking of. Nurse Burn will probably be a shorter video like this one. Six Samurai might be a bit longer, depending on how many games I can get with it, because I just love that deck so much. And Cloudians will also probably be, well, it might be short or long, depending on how long the games take. But hopefully that will close out nicely with Perfect Circle. I don't really feel the need to cover zombies in Perfect Circle format because basically the same deck is from zombie format. It just got worse because the other decks in the format got better. But if people really do want me to cover that, I can. But that's my current plan for the end of Perfect Circle format, and then we'll be jumping in to Dad Returns. So let me know what you think about that game plan down in the comments below. Also, be sure to subscribe if you want to see those videos, get notified when they come out, to hit the bell. You know, that's the best way to do that. Check your sub box, etc. And also join the Discord community if you want to play games in this format or any other formats that I feature on the channel. You'll also be able to play in our tournaments that we have every week and every month there. So definitely head on over there if you want to play in those. As always, big shout out to my patrons, Rinspin, Porkstripe, Brad Knocker, Tyler Compton, GMYFS, Dump Truck, Scout Zero, and Damon. It means a lot that you all just bring this way and encourage me to make more videos like this one in the future. But I hope you all enjoyed this video as always, and until next time, I've been Ben from YGF from Zero, and I'm signing off.